next topic is advisory and infrastructure. So the question, we'll direct this towards you, Stephen, Jeff, and Ari. So states must establish home care rate setting advisory groups. So what collaborative efforts between stakeholders, policymakers, and advocacy groups might be essential to navigate the challenges posed by this provision? And Stephen, if you could kick us off.
Well, this will be a very interesting one because of the various stakeholders and because of our previous experience with various kinds of advisory groups. The MedPAC group, the Medicare Advisory PAC that advises on rate reimbursement and price increases and so forth, doesn't have a very good history of getting their recommendations implemented. And so we then begin to put together these advisory committees at the state level. And if we think about the stakeholders, we've got the leading home care companies in that state. And hopefully our members and the people that we know will be involved in their states to have a voice in that committee. But then we look at the state home care associations, which in most states are primarily focused on the home health and hospice members. And so they don't have a lot of connection with their home care, personal care members. Some states doing a better job than others, but the association will have a role in this. The state HCAOA chapters, and some states have stronger chapters than others, but hopefully they will be engaged as part of these advisory councils. The state Medicaid regulators, the folks who work for the state government, and connected with that, many states are moving to Medicaid managed care. So we have the MCOs that function in that states. And most states have three, or they have, like in Pennsylvania, where John is, they divided the states up in regions, and each region has three MCOs. And then you put all of those people in a room and try to get them to agree. And of course, they're all looking at it from the perspective of the stake that they have in the outcome of this. So it will be a very interesting process. And we look at the issues that these collaborative groups will be dealing with. We talked about rate setting, obviously, but then we have the licensure issue. And I'm working with a group right now doing a project in the state of Connecticut, and the state of Connecticut has passed a law to shift what they have now, which is not licensure, but a registration under the Department of Consumer Protection. They're moving it over to the Department of Public Health for licensure. But yet the Medicaid regulations fall under the Department of Social Services. So getting state licensure to match up with Medicaid requirements so that an agency is clear about what are the criteria that they need to operate in that particular state. We talked about the impact on private pay pricing, and Aaron mentioned the impact as the pay goes up for caregivers and Medicaid companies. What does that do for pay rates for caregivers in private pay companies? And at what point do we look at pricing home care out of reach for that middle group that Aaron talked about? And then how do these collaborative groups in the states take into consideration the unintended consequences as they try to attract younger workers and students to move into home care as an occupation? So there's multiple issues here that are going to make this some very interesting conversations. And one of the questions in my mind always is, who facilitates that conversation? And Jensen, you and I bring some practical experience to this, facilitating mastermind groups for a dozen years, bringing really bright people together around the table to talk about big burning issues. Who in these Medicaid advisory councils at the states leads that process and keeps the group on target and asks the right questions and documents the results. So I think it'll be very interesting to see what comes out of that. And personally, I wouldn't want to be the facilitator of that group. So
Fair enough. Thanks, Stephen, for your feedback. So now we'll shift over to Jeff and Ari, who actually work in multiple states. So I'm really interested in hearing your feedback. So we'll start with you, Jeff.
Yeah, I think what Stephen described is absolutely spot on. I love that answer. I mean, I just add to a couple things. So To be able to get that group going in a state-by-state basis, it's going to happen in one of two ways. Either the legislature is going to have to take action and pass legislation that establishes the advisory council and what their function is, how frequently they meet, and what constitutes the membership of that council. And if that gets introduced, you bet your buttons that there's going to be a lot of interested parties that are trying to advocate for them to be one of the named participants. In that instance, we as an industry will need to be very cognizant of those things and get on board early and really advocate for a member of our industry to be represented. I personally believe the best way to do that is, like Stephen said, a home care association, HCOA chapter, or something like that, because that will feel a little more representative of the entire industry, and that plays a little bit better with legislators when you're trying to put that into law. Second way that this could potentially happen is through rulemaking. In which case the state institution that governs the Medicaid program in each state would put forward the CR 102 for creating a new rule at the state level to establish this advisory council, and then that would be basically appointed by the governor, who sits on that council. In which case, again, we would want to be early to the table on trying to advocate for a member of the industry to be at the table, so that we're not on the menu, as they say. And in my opinion, the best case scenario would be for us to actually find an advocate in the legislature to run the legislation on our behalf. And so, I'd love to use some of my influence to try to get HCOA to create some model legislation that can be used on a state-by-state basis to ensure that the council includes members of industry, so that they have some folks that actually understand what it's like to be on the ground. I believe that there's a high probability of that being the case, because we've got a great bedfellow here in the state Medicaid program managers, all 50 states, unprecedented. All 50 state Medicaid program managers signed a letter opposing the 80/20 rule. So I think that, given the fact that this is the same personnel who would have to enact and then enforce the rule, we've got a unique audience that would probably be empathetic to the fact that we want a seat at that particular table. The key here is that we will have to be super organized and aware of what's going on a state-by-state basis, and try to get us on those councils. Otherwise, we could potentially be completely at the mercy of a group that doesn't understand what we do, and that'd be the worst case scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the feedback, Jeff. Ari.
Jeff, you know who legislators don't care about, despite our beautiful checkered shirts? It's you and me. They do care about are seniors, because seniors vote. I am really surprised at how seemingly ineffective of an alliance we've been able to form with AARP and some other similar senior advocacy groups. Some of those groups really understand the private sector and understand business models, and should be right there, joined at the hip with us on some of these issues, this 80/21 being one of those issues. And so, I would call on HCAOA leaders and other, home care industry leaders that's something we've got to figure out, because right now, we don't have those voices that I can tell you, that is a giant block that votes. And so that's one. Another is, I remember getting into the industry about a dozen years ago and thinking back, 8-10 years ago. PHI was an advocacy and research group that did dig in on what models of care meant, how innovation could occur in our space. And it seems like over the past, 4, 5, 6 years, they've drifted away from caring very much about what the private sector in home care cares about, or not just cares about, but how it operates, into much more of a pure academic research and caregiver only advocacy group. And I think that's to their own detriment. And I think it's to the detriment of everybody in the industry, caregivers included. And so whether it's PHI, shifting course a little bit, whether it's a different organization filling that gap, because there is an academic component to this. There is a need for groups that can get foundation money from the Hartford from those foundations that fund things around senior care and home care. So I think that'll be an interesting thing to see over these next 3 to 6 years. But again, PHI 10 years ago wanted to have a seat at the table. That would be a really powerful, interesting voice to have.
Interesting. Thanks, Ari. Let's open it up to the rest of the panel. Any comments, Rick?
Yeah, I was just going to say, to create that as an expectation that states would establish rate setting advisory groups doesn't necessarily mean that it gives them any teeth to actually create rates. Every state has a legislature that decides how much of that map, that federal match they're going to fund. And in Arizona, we have, rate rebases that occur periodically because it's required by statute to make sure they're actuarially sound. Well, it's interesting how the state writes the check to the actuarial firm, and the actuary firm just always seems to agree that the rates are perfectly fine where they're at. I'm not sure how they do that. But the point that I'm making is that the legislature is going to do what they're going to do anyway. And so we can have an advisory group, and several of our rates are underfunded to the study. The study says you got to pay, $34 an hour, and they pay $28, or whatever they choose to do. And it all comes from what the legislature's going to appropriate.
Fair enough. Good feedback. Anything from you, John, Andrew, Aaron?
From my standpoint,
go ahead, Aaron.
Oh yeah, from my standpoint, I think this showed me something that I feel like we knew, which was we got caught as an industry with our pants down when it comes to data. We don't, as an industry, companies keep data, but we as an industry don't do a good enough job of having data readily available. And from an HCAOA standpoint, I think this is a great opportunity for us to bring more Medicaid providers into the fold, to allow them the opportunity to bring that data as well, which will help in the conversations that we're having right now. From an HCAOA standpoint, and I'll speak about Ohio just because that's the state that I chair and know the most about. We have very little representation when it comes to our Ohio chapter, and we need to have more Medicaid providers to talk to us about where they are and what their needs are, and also give us the data. So I think from I see some individuals on here, guys on here that was a part of the data and research committee with the HCAOA that we're bringing back. But we have to have, as an industry, we've got to be the leaders who say, here's the information, and it's in black and white, and this is why it's important that you listen to us.
Fair enough. All right, John, did you have anything?
Yeah, I guess the whole thought process behind the 80-20 rule being passed to increase availability and access to care is that if you increase the caregiver's wage, essentially, then there should be more people receiving care. I mean, that seems to be, if you really boil down the basis of thought, that's what it is, right? Except it has this giant handcuff on it that caps out, it keeps that percentage there. So the advocacy groups, I think we have to do some education with the policymakers on what that looks like. And I know there's other industries we can look at, but just directly increasing somebody's wages doesn't always lead to more people being in that industry. So just the education of that. And I also think we don't view caregivers as the noble profession that it is in this country. I had replied in the chat to one of the questions, but You think about noble professions in the country, you think about nurses, policemen, firemen, teachers, they're all making differences in the community for the greater good of the community. Yes, they're earning income, but they're making an impact positively on their community. Caregivers are doing the exact same thing. It's just a much newer profession to be in than all the other ones that I previously stated. So how do we, as these advocacy groups, bring that notoriety and that awareness to the profession of caregiving and the importance of what it actually means to the community? So I think that's a task that we need to consider when we're looking at these groups, not just policy making and that type of thing, but how do we really bring that attention to the goodness for the community that caregiving is?
Yeah, thanks for that feedback.